Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Humans of Forensics podcast. My name is Taylor, and I'm a third-year student specializing in forensic psychology. Today, I'm here with another member of the Forensic Society, and we have with us Professor Rasmus Rosenberg Larsen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia. I'm in the second year studying forensic psychology as well as educations. If Professor Larsen would like to introduce himself.
Yes, my name is Rasmus Larsen. Some people call me Professor Larsen. I'm a professor in the forensic science program and also in the philosophy department. I usually teach courses such as Introduction to Forensic Psychology, but also the more dry but just as useful topics such as logic and inferential thinking in the course we call Forensic Theory, for example. So yeah. That's my short spiel.
Perfect. So to start off, I guess we'd just like to know, what did you do to get yourself started? What was your education like? And then how you became a professor at UTM.
Good. Well, my road into becoming a professor is a little bumpy and not as most people's path, if you want to call it that. Some people start their career and they're really goal oriented. They know exactly what they want to be. They know that they want to be a specialist in something, and then they kind of pursue that. I actually went into my undergraduate degree very late in my life. I was 27, I believe, when I enrolled in a college in Denmark, where I'm from, and not at all enrolling in a program that I ended up doing or pursuing a career in. I started out as a business student, and business and philosophy. Yeah, that's a combination in Europe, but it was mainly because of the business side I pursued that program, and I found myself in a philosophy class that I thought was really interesting. And then, after some years, I thought maybe I want to do a philosophy degree and pursue graduate school through that. And then I got accepted into a program I applied to, and which was in Buffalo, New York, of all places. So you might have been, or you might not have, but it's not that far from Toronto. And I did a PhD in philosophy, which of course is not at all what you would associate with themes such as forensic science or forensic psychology, for that matter. But what I did my PhD in was a specialty you might refer to as philosophy of science or philosophy of psychology. And I actually ended up writing my dissertation on psychopathic personality disorder. And that was kind of the entrance into forensic psychology. It turned out when I was done with my PhD, there was a job opening here at University of Toronto, which I pursued. And I ended up teaching both in forensic science program and in the philosophy department. So I would have one semester where I would be teaching forensic psychopathology, and then I would go over the day after and teach philosophy of art in the philosophy department. So it was two very different topics, but it's lucky for me. It was topics that I hold very close to heart and very curious and interested about. So I've been privileged in that way, I guess. So yeah, that was like my story into, or my path into the forensic program and forensic science in general, I guess.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you didn't start off wanting to be a professor.
Yeah, that was not at all in my plans, not at all. To be completely frank with you, when I started college, it was triggered by, so I'm old enough, or you guys are not old enough to remember, or maybe you can vaguely, the financial crisis in 2008. That completely leveled the job markets, and it was not that I was unemployed, but it was more like there was just so many obstacles. So it was actually because of a crisis in the economy that I thought, let's just try to to shuffle the deck of cards and see what happens. And I tried to pursue a degree in business, and yeah, so it's a very strange path. And back to your question about whether I was pursuing a job or career as a professor, not at all. My plan was, even when I was done with done with my PhD in philosophy, my plan was basically just to become a writer and maybe work for a newspaper or something like that. I did not at all plan to become a professor. It was, and you can just stop me if I'm like rambling, but becoming a professor is like, in most fields, it's very few people have the privilege to go that direction, not because people are not capable, but there's so few positions. Okay, so you don't just need the capabilities to pursue that career, which most people when they're done with a PhD have, but you also need the luck. And I was always vividly aware that if you need the luck, you probably don't want to bank on it. So I always had this more of like a contingency plan that was a little bit more safe. So I spent a lot of time writing articles for newspapers and things like that when I was a grad student. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction. So I guess we'd like to start off by talking about some recent events. So we'd like to ask you about the COVID-19 pandemic. So we know that one of your areas of expertise is mental health. So from your own research, what can you recommend as a good way of staying happy while we're staying home? And then what do you do yourself to promote your own mental health?
I'm not a phenomenal example in how you do well as how you treat your own mental health and all that. I know what the research is roughly saying, but I'm not like an ideal case of a person who actually follows that advice. So I know I can look very professional and as if I just have my life under control, but I'm also a human being like everybody else. And I also have my fair share of problems in my daily life. But yeah, I've never really done much research on that side of it. I've never really been involved in any empirical work on mental health. What I've been doing most of my work in that field is to try to improve the research methods so we can kind of gain better insights to do better research basically. But how do we cope with this crisis? This crisis this health crisis obviously had major impact on many different health parameters, if you will, and mental health is definitely one of them. For me, and I think this is kind of the issue in mental health research, there are many cool papers out there. There's a lot of really good research, but what we are finding often is that it's very hard to find generalized things that just works for everyone. So it's first and foremost comes down to figuring out what helps for you. And one thing that might be good for one person might not be good for you. But there seems to be some general markers, and that is to get some exercise and also see other people, which of course is the main challenge to be social in these days, right? But there are ways. Right now we're being social and we have conversations that tend to help people. And these are very intuitive, by the way. It's hard to show empirically, but they're also very intuitive to most people. The danger is when you don't have a straightforward access to these things. Maybe you live in a small condo. Maybe you have your friends and family very far from you. So there can be very clear obstacles where it's easier said than done, if you will.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
I also think it's so nice that some of the courses are offered synchronously so that we can see faces in like a school setting. Mm-hmm. Alrighty.
Absolutely.
So moving on from that question, one of your recent publications, Are Psychopaths Morally Psychologically Impaired? We'd love to hear about the reasoning behind, or like what prompted you to write this article, and maybe some like tips or tricks for students that are interested in publishing, and like what steps to take to get there.
Yeah, so well, let's start with the research. So it was recently published in the end of, or was it in August last year? I forgot. So this work has to do with what we call theories of psychopathy. So for people who are not deeply familiar with this diagnosis, it's formally called psychopathic personality disorder, or we tend to refer to the diagnosis as psychopathy. It's a little bit confusing because some people think we're talking about psychopathology, which of course just means mental illness, but there's also a diagnosis called psychopathy, and traditionally it's been described as people who have profound difficulties in perceiving and understanding moral values and moral obligations. So they just have very difficult time, allegedly, to navigate these social constraints we put on each other, which arguably has something to do with our moral obligations towards each other. This diagnosis has been heavily promoted the last 30 years or so. It's been around, arguably, it's one of the oldest psychiatric diagnostics we actually have, or the oldest diagnostic entities that we have. It dates back to 1786. Is fun fact is that it's the first personality disorder ever to be suggested, actually. But there's a long history about that. If you want to learn more about that, you can go to my class in forensic psychopathology, and we can talk more about that. But the theory has also been, the diagnosis of psychopathy has also been under quite some, it's been subject to some quite heated debates in the academics, broadly construed, like in forensic psychology, but also in mental health research in general. A lot of people are now starting to realize that many of the theories that we have that kind of account for what this diagnosis might be, you cannot really square it with the research we have on it. So, for example, there are so many predictions that these various theories make, but they just don't seem to match reality. For example, some theories predict that the people we diagnose with psychopathy just don't know the difference between right and wrong, or would make various have all sorts of abnormalities in the way they make moral judgments compared to controls. And when we test them, it just doesn't turn out that that's the case, right? They seem to make exactly the same judgments about, classic moral dilemmas. For example, you have all heard about, for example, the trolley problem. Should you pull the lever or not? And psychopaths seem exactly the same responses as normal you and me. So that has kind of given rise to this question whether we should just discard the diagnosis, say this theory doesn't make sense, it's been falsified, end of story, right? So this paper I wrote is, so I should say, and this is kind of how you work as a scientist. I am personally, my opinion is that we should probably get rid of the diagnosis. I am not sure it makes much sense. But in this article I wrote, I tried to kind of play the devil's advocate in a moment and try to see if you could at least come up with a reasonable explanation for maybe there's something that can kind of be saviored in this whole theoretical format. So it's kind of like a way of trying to dig a little bit deeper into. So the article is explicitly about trying to nuance the various theories that has been proposed and pointing out errors that the theories might have in them. So one thing that I dwell a lot on is that there's been an awful lot of talk between linking that maybe psychopaths have, I want to emphasize that maybe psychopaths have very low functioning emotional system or affective system. That, so for example, when you get scared of something, a psychopath allegedly don't, right? So they have a low functioning or a hypo functioning affective system. There's not really been much talk of how that would affect your moral judgments, right? So that aspect has never really been fleshed out in detail. It has just been assumed that if you have a dysfunctional or abnormal affective system, that would kind of show up in your moral judgments, but not in what way. So that's kind of what the article is about. That is kind of trying to see if there's an avenue where we can kind of flesh out a theory that can give some predictions and what these predictions might be, and then see, create or it can at least be a foundation for a research design so we could test whether this is actually true. And I don't have much hope personally that we are actually going to find what I predict with this theory, but at least it would then work the other direction. Namely, if you don't find what theory that would predict, then there's might be even more reason for why we should discard the diagnosis and not deal with it anymore, because it doesn't make much sense, perhaps. So that's kind of that's a very long-winded description of the motivation for that research, but it's some ideas that I've been toying with for the past 5 years at least, which finally had the time to put down on paper and flesh out in more detail. So yeah.
It's interesting that disproving theories is pretty much just as important as proving theories now, right?
Yeah, it's Taylor, it's often been for psychology students, and it can often look like that all we do in psychology is to publish all these neat papers that found significant results, right? It's actually odd. It's a very peculiar aspect about psychology as a discipline. And it is changing, because if you look at other sciences such as physics or biology or things like that, they're explicitly designed to try to falsify the various theories there are there. And arguably that's the hallmark of science, is that it actively tries to disprove itself. But in psychology, there's been this long tradition that dates back to, well, arguably as long as psychology has existed as a field, but probably more strongly since the 60s and 70s, that when we started to do testing on human behavior systematically using the scientific method, there was just this emphasis on novelty, on eye-popping results and things like that, and that it kind of would popularize psychology also. It's really not the purpose of science as much as it is to try to replicate results, which the replication is actually a way to try to falsify things often, to show that that's not necessarily going to follow the results that you got in that one in that one study. We couldn't replicate it in the other, which is another way of saying that we actually falsified it. But this changing in psychology in my opinion, for the better. Psychologists from University of Cardiff wrote a phenomenal book about this, which you can check out. It's called The Seven Deadly Sins of Psychology, where it kind of goes over 7 major things that needs to change in psychology, and one of them is that there needs to be a refocus on replication and falsification and so on in psychology. Yeah, check it out. It's a good book.
Something new, right?
What's that?
Everyone wants to find something new.
Yeah, and it's you cannot blame psychologists for this, by the way, because the whole field is set up in this way. You're not going to get hired if you don't have publications, right? And you're not going to publish anything if it's not novel.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this vicious circle where the journal wants you to come. They don't want to publish things where you said, well, there's this theory that made this prediction and we didn't find it. Most journals will just be like, well, we don't want to publish that, right? But then you don't get the publication, but you did all the work, right? And then you're not going to get hired. So we have created this really vicious circle of incentivizing essentially a method or way of doing science that is very unscientific in many ways. This is a very harsh criticism. It's not intended as such, but there are many things that needs to change in psychology. So it don't ends up being this this field that, in 100 years when they look back, they're just going to think we were silly, right? So I can sit here and say this comfortably, right? Because it's going to be your problem when you're done. you're, you're, you guys are the ones that needs to really reform psychology. I've been with a generation that kind of just starting to point out these problems, and you will be part of the real change when you guys graduate and go into grad school and so on. So.
Okay, that's great. So now we'd just like to ask you a few questions about your own experience in forensics, really. So for starters, what part of forensic psychology are you most interested in? And do you think that this has changed as you moved through the education system, as you've experienced more?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, there's many things I find super fascinating about forensics in general. So it's hard to just pick one thing. But the reason why I came into forensics was kind of like a backdoor through studying psychopathic personality disorder. And when I first started as a lecturer in the program, I didn't have a full appreciation of forensic science. That's something that I have gained, but not fully. I'm still learning every day, and I think most forensic scientists are. Most forensic scientists tend to be specialists, and because it's such a massive system, the legal system, how we use science and legal system is constantly changing. Forensic scientists most cannot cope with the entire complexity, right? What I personally am trying to appreciate more, and what kind of motivates me to stay in the field and want to get more involved is this idea that I think actually resonates with many students, that you want to improve the legal system. Okay, so our legal system does many things really good, or does many things very well, but it's not perfect. And being part of improving such an important institution, if you want to call it that, or social system in our society, like the legal system, is not only fundamental to improving society, but it also seems to have a very real effect for the people who end up in the legal system, right? So that's like a very general perspective I have that kind of motivates me, I guess. And of course, you can only as an individual play a minimal role in that, but you can do what you can do. And being fortunate to be an educator, you can kind of try to hand over your own perspectives and try to you guys, so you can go out and also be part of that change. But personally, what drives me is to not have psychology to play a nefarious role. And one way that the psychology can very quickly, so psychology is introduced in the legal system to do something good, to improve the legal system. For example, it has done so in many, many different ways, and in many ways we don't even appreciate on a normal everyday basis. But for example, it has drawn our attention to, for example, maybe eyewitness testimonies are not always bulletproof, right? Which in most miscarriage of justice, it actually relies on a faulty eyewitness testimony. And that's something psychologists have done, like through decades of research, actually starting to convince a lot of stakeholders in the legal system that we should pay more attention to this problem. But the thing I'm personally focusing on is how the use of psychology can very quickly turn the table, where it can be hijacked by agents in the legal system. So when you take, for example, psychiatric diagnostics, such as, for instance, psychopathic personality disorder, if there truly was a thing called psychopathy, which I don't think there is, then we would probably be justified in using it to some extent. But you can also see how a diagnosis can be misused very quickly, because you can very quickly label people. And when it comes to a diagnosis like psychopathy, it is associated with all sorts of stigmas, all sorts of misconceptions and so on. So it can very quickly become this. Often it is, and this is empirically measurable, you can even find it in legal cases if you scavenge through the databases, that it can very quickly be used as a prosecutorial tool to try to create some sort of stigma on the person being prosecuted. And that's something that motivates me to try to get that out of our system. If we can remove that, at least I can tell myself that I contribute to something I believe is an improvement of the legal system. It's a very small thing, but at least it's something that, the one thing that motivates me at least. But of course, I shouldn't say it's a small thing. In the grand, larger scheme, it's a small thing, but of course it's few individuals. But one could say that if it can, if it can help a person not being mistreated or maltreated in the system, then that's a good thing, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's great. That's very interesting.
Speaking about like changing the legal system and improving the legal system, earlier we talked about how we're constantly publishing things, and with the replication crisis, how do you think we can slowly start to make these improvements, since it has been something that has been happening for so many years prior?
Oh, that's this is really a question, Julia. It's and I'm not sure I have a really good answer to it. There's this, it's a conundrum almost. I mean, not almost, it is. The legal system has absolutely nothing to do with the academic world. It's just, what I mean by that is that whatever we find in our, in the world of science, doesn't just automatically translate into practices in the legal system, especially not in the court system. Whatever the court decides is good science, that's what is in that world considered good science, right? That's how we operate here in the real scientific world, right? We have methods and we have standards we follow, and when something has been disproven, it's commonly, at least fairly shortly, accepted as the new truth, if you will. But that's not how it goes in the legal system. And there are many different levies and vehicles that kind of plays into that. One thing, of course, is within the court system, where, if there's precedents, then it kind of is the snowball that keeps rolling, right? We have ways that we can deal with that in the court system, but I think the larger problem, there's a tendency, at least in my experience, to forget that the legal system is much more than the court system, right? The court system carries out a very specific function, and that is to figure out guilt or not guilty, right? And then, or resolve disputes, and then eventually also to sentence, right? In the courts, the judicial system, if you will. But after that, people also go into a much larger system, the correctional system, with the parole system and all sorts of various agents involved there. And I think especially there is, and also in law enforcement for that matter, there is an even larger problem in how to implement better, or how to inform practices with science, right? So there are many, you will find, if you end up in law enforcement, you will find there's plenty of practices and methods in there that is not entirely kosher when it comes to science, right? That you can even find pseudoscience widely applied in some jurisdictions. It's a problem in Canada, maybe not a massive problem per se. I could point out many, but I'm not gonna here. But there, it varies from country to country. And as forensic scientists, I think in the future we'll see one of the larger responsibilities we have is to actually change those parts of the legal system. That can be done through maybe lobbying with policymakers to actually make this an issue. In United States in 2015, there was a major campaign by forensic scientists and they got a lot of political capital to make changes, but eventually it was kind of partially discarded. But there was a big push in the later years of Obama to actually invest a lot of money in improving, kind of instilling more science into the legal system. And that got scaled back, but there's a lot of really cool initiatives. And that it kind of goes into tying policymakers, those who write the policies of our societies, and then the people has to enforce those policies and kind of build new institutions, new agencies, and so on. So that's I see as the major challenge. We should also improve the court system, but there's many other things that needs improvement. The way we contribute also as forensic scientists, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. That was a lot of knowledge wrapped up in a really big picture to like see. Moving on from like the legal system, we had a question about what would be advice or something that you would like to tell either yourself when you were a student or students like us.
Oh, that's there's many, I guess. Being a student is hard. It really is. You're starting out from scratch basically, and there's so many things, is minimum requirements, this and that, and things you have to do. But I guess one advice I think that kind of permeates with everything is that you should really follow your curiosity through all this. You should go to university. I know this is really easy and it can sound super privileged, like, because not everyone can just pick a degree depending on what they found interesting and what they're curious about, right? But many people can here at the University of Toronto, at least, because we are an extremely privileged bunch of people. But yeah, if there's so many expectations, there's so many skills and methods and whatever you have to acquire, but you're only going to be successful if you pursue the thing that really triggers your curiosity. At least that's my experience. I have had so many students who are doing something because it's not because it's really what they burn and desire or burn for, but it's because what they have been told or what they think society expects them. It's if you and it kind of goes deeper than just your own personal aspirations. You're never going to excel in something if you don't find it interesting, right? But people don't want to hire people who are not curious and who really love what they're doing. So we're very privileged in forensic science, the forensic science program, because just about every student we have here, they really burn for forensic science, and they really find it fascinating for many good reasons. But it is really, so if you're one of those individuals that have finally found something that you think is interesting, then you're both lucky, but you're also going to excel at it if you really put time and hard work into it. I just want to add to that also that it can be hard to find what you really desire and burn for. So I'm not talking, when I talk about desire and curiosity, I'm not talking about that you should just, every time the alarm rings, that you should just like jump out of your bed because you're so excited to go to the university. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that you have found something that you actually find interesting. What you will find later is that the more knowledge you acquire about this topic, it tends to become more and more interesting. The more you kind of opens up the Pandora's box, right? You will see more and more complexities. The field will get harder because you realize the complexity. And you will sometimes find that your studies becomes more difficult, but it's probably a good sign. It's probably just a sign that you're starting to actually churn some butter up there, that you're actually gaining insights, right? So follow your curiosity. Please do yourself and everybody else a favor and do that. It's it's the way to do it, at least in my experience.
Mhm.
All right.
I guess if we have time for one more short and sweet finishing question, it would be, where do you see yourself in, say, 10 years, 5 years, like somewhere down the road? What are your goals for yourself?
Oh, cool. I really like that question. So I have many so my problem is often that I get involved in too many projects, but I don't have any kids, so I can really throw myself into research and things like that. Um, but I have some visions with the forensic science program, things that I want to do. Forensic science, in all fairness, is really in its infancy. You making use of science in the legal system is a fairly new development. And we haven't even looked into what we can do with this in terms of improving our legal system, right? We have pursued many of the low-hanging fruit, such as identification of human remains and DNA analysis and all these things, but there are many other things we can do. So one of the visions that I want to kind of tap into down the line, and this might be in this 10-year horizon or something like that, is to create some sort of a center for forensic knowledge, basically, where you create so we have the forensic science program, which focus on educating future forensic scientists, but I think we can do better. We can do an institute / center where we talk broadly about how do we want to do knowledge in the legal system, right? We want to inform all sorts of practices in there with our best human knowledge practice, named science, right? So we can kind of bind forensic sciences as specialist disciplines together with law enforcement education, together with attorneys, so we can make a better prosecutorial process also, so we can kind of combine and even also make it for almost like a center where policy developers also come in and kind of, so there's a conversation, so there's no fragmentation anymore. And hopefully will come out of that is of course dialogue, in terms of how do we make a more just society, which of course starts in many places with making a better legal system. It's not the only thing. We also need better policies, social policies, and so on. But we also, what an institute like that could focus on is to creating standards, right? So it doesn't matter where a person is arrested or prosecuted, whether it's in Alberta, Ontario, or Vancouver, or in this precinct and this, it's all the same standards we use in terms of all the forensic scientific methods as fingerprinting and so on, but also just everything we use is just standardized, right? And that's some of the visions that I'm toying with. And this would not be the first time it's done. There's some examples of this here and there in the world, but I think that generally improving the legal system, because it's becoming more and more complex, you also kind of need an institute / center somewhere where all the different stakeholders in that system can kind of come together. And I think that dialogue should be science driven. Not necessarily in that sense that it's experimental driven. Of course, experiments will play, but more that it's informed by all the virtues we find in science. Science is successful because it follows various methodologies. It's the pinnacle of human thinking and human knowledge. And that's what I think should inform the development of our legal system, not, for example, a political debate. That's not what's going to inform our legal system. That's how it is today, most of the times. But I think we can do better, right? We can push that conversation to a place like UTM, for example, where we would have an institute where there would be, a biannual conference about these topics that goes broader, linking criminology, forensic science, political science, and so on together. So I know that's a lot. but those are some of the visions I'm toying with, and of course you can see I haven't really fleshed out all the details of this, but at least that's some of the future plans.
Well, it sounds great.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think it also ties really nicely with the conversation we've had today about making changes and improvements for our society. But yeah, with that question, we've wrapped up our podcast today, and I want to thank Professor Larson for joining us and giving us so much insightful knowledge. But yeah, if students would like to reach out to you, is there somewhere you feel comfortable for them to come chat with you?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me. And yeah, my office door is always open. Of course, these days it's not, but but metaphorically, it's always open. You can knock on my doors, shoot me an email, whatever. I hopefully the students who have experience with me hopefully see me as a very approachable person and down to earth. And I'm always welcome to hear about your ideas as well.
All right, thank you, Professor Larson.